What is a Cascara and what is a Takouba, and why are they not the same? Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So the fact is that I am just getting ready and getting stock labelled up, ready to go to the Kempton Park Classic Arms Fair, which is on this weekend. If you happen to be anywhere around London, then why don't you come down to Kempton Park Racecourse and you can see me on Sunday and we can have a chat and maybe you can buy some swords. But I'm labelling up some swords of which I thought, you know, I don't normally deal in an awful lot of African weapons. Are these African? Are these European? We'll come to that in a second. I'm going to keep this fairly brief. But given that these are going into my box of stock to take with me, I thought I'd make a quick video about these. So, these are two types of North African sword, and you'll notice they look a little bit like medieval swords, okay? They have cross hilts and they have pommels and they have straight double-edged blades. And in fact, a lot of these blades, as I've mentioned in previous videos, were actually exported from Germany, sometimes also Italy, sometimes Britain and France, and Spain and other countries. But Germany was the biggest exporter of these blades, and these sorts of blades are actually also found in other parts of the world, sometimes on palashes in Eastern Europe, sometimes even on Highland basket hilts. I won't say they're exactly the same, but they're similar. So essentially, Germany was an absolute Chad when it came to producing sword blades, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, but even before that as well. And so they were exporting blades all over the shop and selling them in exchange for things that Germans wanted. Anyway, so a lot of these blades ended up in Africa, and a lot of them were actually forged in Africa as well, or at least sometimes they were copies of German blades made in North Africa, and sometimes they're actually just completely indigenous. Both of these swords being types of sword rather, the Takouba and the Cascara, we'll come to the differences in a second. Sometimes in the Victorian and Edwardian period, so 19th and early 20th centuries, you will find in books that these people thinking these were survivors from the Crusader period, from the Crusades. There weren't an awful lot of Crusades in the Sudan, I have to point out. But anyway, there was a perception particularly in Victorian Britain, and I think in America as well, that these were the descendants of Crusader swords. So this is based on the fundamental misunderstanding that the only people with straight swords in North Africa and the Middle East were European Christians. And this is of course completely wrong. The Ottoman Turks had straight swords of various sorts. I mean, even the Prophet Muhammad had straight swords. But in the crusading period, First, Second and Third Crusades, here's the newsflash, the majority of Islamic forces fighting against Crusaders used straight swords. That's right, they weren't all double-edged, some were single-edged, but the majority of people at this time, from the, let's say, 11th through to the 12th, end of the 12th century, early 13th century, were using straight swords, many of them double-edged, on both sides. So it didn't matter whether you were Muslim, Christian, Jewish, whatever. Most people at that time in that part of the world were using straight swords. Not to say curved swords weren't coming in, and curved swords were starting to come in the period of the Third Crusade, a little bit after that actually. But really curved swords didn't predominate in the region, at least in the Middle East, really until the 13th, 14th century. Right, okay, so coming back to these. These are in fact a completely indigenous style of sword. They both feature straight blades. Now they're not the same. So for first bit, here are the differences, and this is if you want to learn whether something's a Cascara or a Takouba, these are the bullet points. First of all, Cascara blades usually are parallel edged with a point at the end, double edged, or usually, not always, but usually. Very often they have multiple fillers, although sometimes they have single fillers. And they are usually quite long, about 35 or 36 inches in the blade. In contrast, the typical Takouba blade is tapering, so it starts broader and then narrows down, unlike the parallel edges of the Cascara. So it tapers down, which you might think makes it a better thrusting sword, but then weirdly, most Takouba have a spatulate point. A lot, like the vast majority, 90+% of Takouba don't have a pointy point on the end. Why? I don't know. Maybe we could look at that in a future video. But both of these weapons were not used to thrust very much. We've actually got film footage of people using these weapons, and they predominantly used them to cut, like 90+%, okay? Usually used with a shield, a buckler of various sizes and designs. Again, perhaps we could look at that in a future video. Right, that's the differences of both. Oh, the other thing to say is the Takouba, as well as being tapered and not being very pointy, is usually shorter. These usually have around a 32-inch blade. Right, the hilts, you will see, although they're superficially similar, they're actually pretty different. The Cascara has an iron crossguard with languettes that go up and down. The languettes go underneath the grip here and they help secure the whole thing. So you have cross-shaped crossguard, okay, with languettes, and then the grip is wood with leather wrapped around, and you have a wood and leather pommel cap at the end. I've actually got another example here where you can see it a little bit more clearly. There we go. But exactly the same type of crossguard, iron cross, languettes up and down, wood and leather wrapped around, and then wood and leather pommel section at the end, but with no metal in it, usually. Okay, sometimes they're covered in sheet silver or something like that, but not very often. Takouba's completely different, very, very broad cross here with metal inside, leather over the top, and then either a wood or metallic grip and a cylindrical or circular pommel cap, metal cap. So, actually very different swords. These, the Cascara, were used predominantly by the Hadendawa tribe, people like the Beja and people like that. These were used by the Tuareg. So Tuareg Takouba and Hadendawa or Sudanese Cascara. Similar swords, possibly related, but definitely not the same. I hope that now has helped you to tell which is which. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope I see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.